If we were to peel back the dense cloud of fog that covered Europe towards the end of the first quarter of the 5th century AD, we would see the silhouette of a Roman Empire that had long left behind its former glory days and was dying with the destructive currents of the Germanic tribes. So much so that this silhouette always looks fainter than it is. Emperors who turned into puppets in the hands of the barbarians, the pungent smell of smoke rising from the razed cities, and the blood staining the rivers red as a result of years of massacres. The empire was reshaped in fire and ashes over the past 50 years under the swords of barbarian warriors. First, in 378, the co-emperor Valens was defeated by the Cutlars at Edirne and slaughtered on the battlefield. In the years that followed, catastrophes would follow one after another. The land from the Balkans to Italy was trampled under the hooves of horses driven by the ruthless Gothic warriors. For centuries, the Germanic tribes beyond the rivers Rhine and Danube, the Roman frontiers collapsed, unable to withstand the destructive force of the incessant human flood. Vandals and other houses overran vast tracts of land stretching from the Danube to North Africa. A year later, Gothic Alaric and his men captured Rome and sacked it for 3 days. The fall of the Holy City would soon cause the fear that had sprouted in the hearts of the people to spread. Terror and anxiety were now felt in every corner of the empire, and cities and towns began to be abandoned. A small spark in the east, caused by the movement of the Huns, soon turned into a giant flame that swept across Europe. Church annals and personal diaries were overflowing with the wish for an end to the disasters that had reduced Europe to a heap of ashes, but the authors of these lines were unaware that what had happened so far was only the beginning. Soon, whispers of a legend began to ring vaguely in the ears of the people, and the tales of horror that were told gave life to the seeds of a new fear. The church called him the Whip of God, a title that soon became popular among the Romans. The horse would soon become an indispensable motif in the horror stories of the period because when the Whip of Goth swung across Europe, all the disasters that had ever happened would be nothing more than a pleasant memory. Attila was the son of a man named Munchik, a member of the Tulu tribe. His father had died when he was a young boy, so he and his older brother Hada were raised by their uncle Ruha. The sources of the period are rather silent about his childhood and youth, so Attila's activities during this period are shrouded in obscurity. But given that he came from a tribe that had produced rulers, he was a future ruler. It would not be an exaggeration to think that Attila was brought up as a barbarian because Jordanes, one of the most important sources of the period, reports that he participated in the Hun War Council from an early age. In addition, Attila's upbringing was quite different from the image of the barbarian in the minds of the Romans. Amelius, who wrote about Attila in a hateful style in the following years, would write that he was as successful in diplomacy as he was in barbarism. He knew the language of grass. Both of these madmen spoke fluently, and his skills in using the bow and sword would soon be tested by his enemies and would become a legend that would be told for generations. So much so that many of the Western sources written during this period included lines claiming that he carried the sword of Mars, the god of war. These legendary narratives would soon cause an extraordinary text to take shape around Attila. This mix was mixed with fear and horror and soon took place in the minds and hearts of all European people. So much so that Attila had become a surreal figure whose hair-covered face resembled a wild scrap, who killed his brother for the sake of his ambition and desires, ruthlessly cooked his sons, and ate them with pleasure. He was likely because every whisper of terror that spread around made him an even more feared leader in this age of brute force and rage. The process that would transform Attila from an ordinary member of the dynasty into the ruler of all of them began with the sudden death of his uncle Rua. In a short time, a peace meeting will be held in Margos with the Eastern Roman envoys. Attila immediately takes the initiative and reaches Margos by traveling through Morova. What will happen here is very important for his future because at that time the Hun state was ruled by his uncles Oktar and Ibars, another partner of the throne. Attila must, at all costs, excel in these negotiations and get the Roman envoys to accept the conditions, and he has made all his preparations accordingly. When the Roman envoy arrives in the scientific city, he will not like the view he encounters. This is a clear insult on behalf of both the emperor and the Aplanthas, but the envoy knows that he still has to continue the negotiations. In any case, the Eastern Roman Emperor desires peace at Theodosi Margos too. It is not certain whether Attila knew this, but his insistence on accepting the terms of the negotiations in favor of the Huns is quite clear. During the negotiations, the delegation accompanying Filinta will record his words: "Either you accept, or we will fight. The decision is yours." In the face of this determination, the righteous Roman delegation. Thus, Attila returned to his country with what he wanted. In the following period, Attila and Bleda began to rule the Hun state as co-rulers, but the relationship between them is quite ambiguous in the sources of the period. Although a considerable amount of Western records write that he killed even the elder brother for the sake of his ambitions, even recent studies strengthen the possibility that Attila may have died of his own accord because the Vladi were erased from the historical records very quickly. The most authentic record of him, however, is the following lines left behind by the historian Priscus, who was sent as an envoy to the Hun state 3 years after the event. Even their king was assassinated by his brother Attila. In these cities of fear and confusion, Attila began to lay the foundations of the frightening image he would acquire in the years to come. The eastern part of the empire felt the impact of the destruction and catastrophe. First of all, the eastern part of the empire felt the impact of the First and Second Balkan campaigns of the Eastern Roman Empire in the Balkans. The once glorious cities that had once glittered in the glow of the Park novel were now covered with clouds of black smoke that had come to life through destruction and devastation, and what's more, these clouds of smoke were now moving towards the heart of the empire, towards Constantinople. In 447, led by Attila the Hun, they had broken the last resistance at Gallipoli, and this was the end of everything for Eastern Rome. The world was close enough to drown the immortal city if it stretched out its hands. Terror and panic soon spread to the whole city, but amid this chaos, the news of the favorable outcome of the peace negotiations through Senator Anatolius reached the palace. In 450 AD, Attila received a letter from Ravenna, the capital of Western Rome. The letter was written by Princess Honoria, the sister of Emperor Valentinianus. In addition, an engagement ring was found in the envelope. Honoria was proposing to Attila in exchange for breaking her marriage with an old senator, or at least that is how Attila interpreted the message according to Western historians. Valentinianus was horrified to learn of his brother's actions and sent an emissary to Attila to inform him that it was all a misunderstanding, but his efforts were in vain, and Attila demanded that the bride and dowry be handed over to him. Otherwise, his army would winter in Rome this year, but his request was not fulfilled. Thus began a series of devastating events that would tear Europe apart in the next 2 years. Attila crossed the Danube with his army and headed towards the interior of Europe. Some sources, such as Jordanes, claim that the size of his army reached about 500,000, and the major cities of Gaul were either surrendering or being slaughtered under their attacks. Attila advanced as far as Belgium and turned the land he left behind into a ball of fire. The civilization that the novel claimed to have built for centuries was on the verge of extinction within a few months with the sword blows of the warriors they called barbarians. The Huns led by Attila eventually slaughtered the people of the 2 famous cities of Gaul. Flavius, one of the last qualified commanders of Rome, and the theoretical Attila the Huns were welcomed here by the king of the Cut. Thus, the last great battle of antiquity took place in the heart of Gaul, and although sources differ about the outcome of the battle, it was a massacre that day. Theodoric, the king of the Cut, was one of the victims of this massacre. The losses on both sides were in the hundreds of thousands. Moreover, Attila and his armies were stopped for the first time in this war. However, this was not the end for the great Hun sovereign. In 452, he returned to Europe again with his wounds healed. His first target was Aquileia. He crossed the Alps of Julia, which was defended by Heretius with a small force. Respectively, Alpini Badu and Concordia turned into a flame with the attacks of the Huns. Visa to Verona, Brake Pergamum, and Milan chose to surrender without resistance. The great cities and castles of Italy fell to the Huns one by one. Finally, the empire found the solution by sending the vote to Attila as an envoy with the consciousness of the Pope. Although the negotiations between the Pope and Attila are not known exactly, the negotiations were certainly concluded in the way that Rome wanted. Finally, Attila left Italy with his men. Some sources suggested that the reason for this sudden withdrawal was a plague epidemic that broke out in the army. Who knows? Maybe he was thinking of returning next year when he left there, but whatever he was thinking, he had no time left to put it into action. When he returned to his country, he married a young and beautiful woman named Ildigo, celebrated his wedding night by eating and drinking, and then went to bed. The next day, his men found the Hun king strangled with the blood accumulated in his throat. Today, historians bring two possible explanations for Attila's death, one of which is that he was poisoned, and the other possibility is poisoning due to excessive alcohol consumption. Attila's death was a deep blow to the Eastern and Western Roman empires. The fear and terror that had settled over Europe began to slowly unravel. The empire that Attila had built was divided among his sons following his death, each spending the resources at his disposal trying to expand the land in his favor. Indeed, by 469, just 16 years after Attila's death, the empire he had built had completely disintegrated, but his name would live on for centuries in the legends of the Huns and the horror stories written by Europeans.